Okay, welcome everyone. I see that we do still have a few people coming on and joining, but it is 5:30, so we'll try to get started with a few housekeeping type items while people continue to join us. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening for our presentation of alternatives to the Danskammer gas plant. Danskammer, isn't it worth getting right? My name is Haley Carlock, and I am the Director of Environmental Advocacy for Scenic Hudson. And before we get started, I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping logistical things. You'll be hearing directly from some of the experts we worked with on these alternatives today. Some of them weren't able to join us live, but I sat down with them last week to discuss their analyses and conclusions, and we will be showing you recordings of our conversations today. We aren't going to be having a live Q&A period after the presentation today, but if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little Q&A button, and please feel free to pose any questions that you may have there. And we do have somebody monitoring the Q&A, and she will try to get to as many of the questions as she can. And if there are any that we're not able to answer today, we'll try to get back to you and make sure we can get you those answers. And with that, let's get to the presentation. So it's no secret that Scenic Hudson opposes Danskammer's plans for a gas-fired power plant on the Hudson River because of its environmental and climate change impacts. But we understand that some people in the community are concerned about potentially losing an industrial development that provides significant funds to the local tax base. But I think there are some things that probably everyone here in attendance tonight can agree on. We all want to protect everything that makes the Hudson Valley a great place to live, work, and play. We all want a healthy environment for our community. We want a healthy economy, and we want healthy people and healthy families. We also all want Danskammer Point to be an asset to the local community, both now and into the future. We want it to be a location that can create jobs, can contribute to the tax base, and certainly will not be a risk to public health. And with that in mind, if you can go to the next slide, we set out about 18 months ago to engage experts to analyze how we could maximize long-term benefits and minimize the risk to those important tax revenues and public health at this site. We engaged experts in energy finance and in industrial design and landscape architecture to evaluate potential future uses for this site, and as well as the merits of Danskammer's current plan for a gas plant. And there were a couple of things that they both all concluded: that the proposed gas plant is a risky choice, and that a bulk battery storage facility is a safe, sensible, and sustainable option. Next slide, please. But you don't have to take my word for it. First, we're going to hear directly from one of our experts, Jim Guidera from Ghent Associates. Jim looked at the merits from a financial perspective of Danskammer's current plans for a new gas plant, and also at the merits of a potential battery storage facility at the site. Jim has over 30 years of experience working with United States and international banks on financing energy projects, and has raised financing for both gas-fired power plants and renewable projects. So Jim knows exactly what the folks who are providing the funding for the Danskammer project are thinking and how they will be looking at this project. Since he has retired from the banking industry, Jim teaches at Columbia University in energy project finance, and he also opened his consultancy, Ghent Associates. So now we'll hear from Jim. Thanks, Jim. And now turning to the plans of the owners of the Danskammer Power Station to develop a new combined cycle power plant, how would you evaluate Danskammer's financing prospects?
Well, a 500 megawatt combined cycle power plant would cost in the neighborhood of about $600 million. And that sort of financing isn't on hand for the owners of Danskammer. They're going to need to raise that capital as a combination of debt in the range of 300 million or so, and passive equity from other investors and similarly sized, by convincing them that this kind of project would be profitable as we're adding more capacity to the Hudson Valley. That might have been feasible a few years ago when the region was expecting to lose capacity from the closure of Indiantown, and when power prices and capacity prices favored new capacity additions. But those additions have been made in the last 3 years by others, and it wouldn't be feasible today to add another 500 megawatts of capacity to the market.
Thanks, Jim. And sort of a natural segue to our next question, which is how have the financial prospects for a new combined cycle plant like Danskammer changed over the past few years, and why?
Well, let me start with some of the market forces that are at play here. New York is organized as a competitive wholesale market. The utilities that provide you and me with electricity, like Central Hudson Gas and Electric, buy their electricity from the power market, where prices are set through auctions that happen throughout the day by generation market participants. These prices need to be high enough to be profitable for a gas-fired power plant during those peak periods when most of the load is peaking in the region. What's happened in the recent years is that a combination of forces have reduced power prices in the lower Hudson Valley, actually throughout the state, but there's a particular issue in the lower Hudson Valley. Low gas prices, low demand for electricity, and new capacity that's been added by other developers that efficiently converts gas to power prices has caused the moments when peak pricing that would be profitable for a new center to be reduced significantly. On top of that, in New York State, the generation companies are compensated with capacity payments. This is another form of compensation to supplement generators so that New York will always have a sufficient reserve margin of generation capacity that exceeds demand, so that there would never be a moment when there isn't enough electricity to satisfy demand. And capacity payments are determined by auctions run by the New York Independent System Operator under a formula where they're high when we need more capacity, when the reserve margins are getting low, and when they're low, they become low when we have too much power. In 2017 and 2018, again, probably motivated by the expectation that Indian Point would close, capacity payments were high and they favored new capacity additions. The two plants have already been added to the market with 1,800 megawatts of combined capacity. The Wayzata Valley Energy Station, and in Dover, the Cricket Valley Station. These are up and operating, and when they became operable in 2019, the capacity market collapsed. We now had too many generators bidding into the market, and so capacity prices that would really have motivated lenders and passive equity investors to finance yet another plant, such as Danskammer is proposing, would no longer be available. In fact, many of these lenders and investors are unpleasantly surprised with how quickly capacity markets dropped for the projects that they have financed.
Thanks, Jim. Are these factors related to the COVID-19 pandemic, and will power prices recover once the pandemic ends?
Well, no, this is more fundamental than that. Although the COVID-19 pandemic is influencing demand is softer as a result of lower economic activity, and power and gas prices, which influence power prices, are also soft for reasons related to the pandemic. The overbuild that has happened in the lower Hudson Valley already occurred before the pandemic. This was felt and observed in early 2019, and that's not going to go away. The load might recover somewhat, but we have more kilowatt hours of capacity being produced and producible by the new gas-fired plants that I mentioned, and some upgrades to other existing plants, that the prices will be soft for a while.
Thanks, Jim. And now sort of turning to the other side of the coin, I think we've covered sort of what the market's doing and how those forces are influencing the viability of Danskammer's plan. But how does New York climate policy, how are the changes that are going on there influencing Danskammer's prospects?
Well, New York's climate policy is not going to be good for gas-fired generation in general, and certainly will adversely affect Danskammer's prospects. So among the goals of the 2019 Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act is an objective to add 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind to the New York power pool and another 6,000 megawatts of distributed solar. And these sources do not have, once deployed, do not have marginal costs. So the more you add wind and solar to the generation mix, the more you're adding generators who can bid into the power auctions at whatever price is prevailing. So they will have the effect of depressing energy prices as they become deployed, and narrow even further the moments when a gas-fired generator who can only operate when the price is high enough to cover their cost of consuming gas can operate.
So in summary then, are Danskammer's plans to build a new gas plant economically feasible in your opinion?
No, it might have been feasible. It might have looked like a good idea 3 or 4 years ago when, as I mentioned, the region had a potential shortfall in generation with the closure of Indian Point. But that gap has been filled and then some by the new plants that have been added to the market and other upgrades. And now with the prospects of more wind and solar being added to the market, the need for another gas-fired generator is certainly not apparent at all.
All right, so now we're going to turn to storage. And one thing that we're always encountering when we talk about these things in the public realm is like people don't understand like what battery storage is. They get power plants, they sort of understand wind and solar, but how does battery storage work, and how is it really important to a reliable, clean energy grid?
Well, battery storage as a utility scale resource is fairly new, but its deployment has been accelerating in recent years at a dramatic pace. The battery storage facilities are based on the lithium-ion batteries that power cars. The build out of electric vehicles has caused the manufacturing and supply chain for lithium-ion batteries to produce these modules at cheaper and cheaper prices. So it's becoming economic. The batteries are stored in racks as modules within container-sized shelters that have sufficient heating and cooling to control the climate that's required for these kinds of facilities, and they are easily deployed in a modular way. Bulk battery storage is a business model where the batteries are charging when power on the grid is cheapest, so that they can discharge during peak hours, thereby earning an energy arbitrage profit, and also performing other services for the grid that are compensated in New York and in other markets.
Thanks, Jim. Has energy storage grown in recent years? Is it expected to continue to grow? Is this sort of an emerging and increasing market?
Yes, the deployment of battery storage has accelerated in the last few years, owing to a couple of drivers. The capital costs have come down materially, so that they become more economic as an investment. And as grids become more green, with more wind and solar on the grid, battery storage becomes very important to complement those generators and address the intermittency issues that are attendant on that.
Do you think that battery storage is a more sound investment in New York State today generally than combined cycle gas plants? And if so, why?
Well, yes, I've already mentioned the market drivers that are going to make it more and more difficult for gas-fired generation to compete. As more renewable sources are added to the grid, market pricing for energy will come down. Moments when gas-fired plants can be profitable will be shrinking. The prospects for capacity revenues will not improve if you have more offshore wind and distributed solar in the market. Distributed solar tends to sap load too when it's installed on site and serving on site loads. So these forces are going to make it harder for gas-fired generation to compete. This is leaving aside the issue of whether the implementation of New York's climate policy involves regulations that make it more burdensome for gas-fired generators. I'm just focusing in this discussion on what simple market forces. In contrast, as the grid becomes greener with more renewable energy sources, the need for a battery to store energy that's produced when at moments when peak load is not arrived, but deliver it later on during the peaks, will become more and more necessary. And so the economics for batteries are going to improve on the compensation side. And then on the investment side, we've seen a downward trend in the cost of capital cost of installing these sources, and that's only got to come down further as supply chains expand and improve.
So as you just heard from Jim, for the foreseeable future in the Hudson Valley, combined cycle gas plants like the one that Danskammer is proposing are a very risky proposition. They're going to have a lot of difficulty attracting financing. The investment world is not looking right now, especially in New York, to invest in gas-fired power generation. They're facing uncertain revenue sources and operating margins that have been on the decline over the past few years. In fact, the gas plants that were recently built and started operating in New York State are now very concerned that they are not getting their expected return on their investment. And of course, there are the regulatory and policy mandates that are driving us away from a grid that is based on fossil fuel burning. And that's at the state level, but there could also be changes coming at the federal level that could lead to an even more quick and aggressive move away from fossil fuel fired generation. And Jim's analysis, as you heard, really focused for the most part, of course, on Danskammer's proposed new plant. But I'll also mention that he did look at the prospects for keeping the existing plant at the site running. And that existing plant barely runs because it's so old and inefficient. In the last several years, it's operated at less than a 1% capacity factor. So it really just operates a few times a year. Because of that, it very much relies on those capacity payments that Jim mentioned, because it's really selling barely any electricity to the grid. And because of the collapse of the capacity market, due to the overbuilding of power plants in the Hudson Valley, even aside from the regulatory changes, from a market perspective, that plant is simply not going to be able to meet its operating costs much longer. And again, we heard that utility bulk battery storage is a much more economically sound choice today and in the future. It aligns very nicely with the evolution of the energy market towards renewable resources and the state policy drivers that are making that so. It's supported by numerous financial incentives and is becoming much more cost competitive. And importantly, it's a very flexible proposal. It can be built in phases, it can be expanded over time, making it easier to finance and more attractive. Next slide, please. So you've heard about sort of the economic side of things, why the Danskammer proposal is not a good idea and why battery storage makes more sense. And now we'll turn to the folks who actually looked at the site and designed what a battery storage facility could look like. We collaborated with folks at the University of Pennsylvania Stuart Weitzman School of Design, who are experts in industrial design and landscape architecture. And when we first engaged with them, we didn't start out with the proposition that this is going to be a battery storage facility. Can you design it for us? We didn't have that foregone conclusion. We simply asked them to look at the suitability of the site for beneficial alternative uses with the following things in mind. We wanted something that could provide concrete economic benefits to the community and that would be environmentally healthy, safe, and sustainable. Those were the parameters we gave them, and the team at Penn came up with several different potential designs that we evaluated. And after vetting them, the battery storage alternative was the one that seemed to make most sense for this site. On to the next slide, please. So first, we're going to hear from one of our experts from Penn, Nate Wooten. Nate is a registered landscape architect at the firm Olin, and he specializes in large park and environmental planning projects that integrate complex infrastructure. He is also an adjunct lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania, teaching large site design and regional planning. And he looked at the site features and how and where on the site battery storage might be able to be sited. Thanks, Nate. And when you looked at the Danskammer site, what features of the site specifically made it suitable for something like a battery storage facility?
So we first started looking at the Danskammer site as part of a studio at the University of Pennsylvania's Department of Landscape Architecture last fall. And during that studio, several students started working specifically at the Danskammer site, and we're looking at different possibilities for its future. Several of those students continued working on this project through the summer and supported this effort in our design study, evaluating the site for potential areas for battery storage. First and foremost, what makes the Danskammer site suitable for a battery storage facility is its regionally strategic location in the New York State power grid, halfway between upstate generation sources and major usage areas around New York City. At the site scale, Danskammer's existing uses in energy generation site is also a strength. The existing energy transmission lines and switchyard infrastructure that currently take electricity away from the Danskammer site can also bring energy to the site for storage. This removes the cost of building new transmission lines and new switchyards that might be associated with other sites and other battery storage projects. Lastly, the relative isolation and remoteness of the site and the fact that it's shielded from adjacent communities by topography and vegetation also means that the batteries are unlikely to have any direct visual or other impacts on nearby communities.
What criteria did you and the rest of the team consider in deciding which specific locations on the site would be most appropriate for the actual battery storage modules?
For battery storage, it's most appropriate where you have flat areas clear of obstruction and unlikely to be impacted by major hazards like flooding. On the Danskammer site, we also looked at things like proximity to switchyards and transmission lines that might be positive things to locate the batteries close to. Given the site's current use, it was ultimately some of the more flat areas associated with the current Danskammer power plant that were most suitable for battery storage. Given the site's history of flooding during Hurricane Sandy, flat areas in current floodplains along the waterfront and areas anticipated more likely to flood within the next 50 years due to sea level rise were not considered suitable for batteries. This was sort of the first thing we looked at on the site. Areas with existing vegetation or wetlands were also excluded to protect the site's ecology. Lastly, the large coal ash landfill on the upland part of the site was also excluded due to concerns about structural stability and permitting. Of the 150-acre property, 5 acres were found to be ideally suitable for battery storage. And while this may seem like a small area of the site, it's more than a large enough area for a large battery storage facility.
What other, potential uses might fit well on the site along with the battery storage facility that you designed? What else could go with that?
Compared to a fossil fuel power plant, battery storage units are potentially compatible with a variety of other uses. Many areas of the site would remain open. And the two areas with the greatest long-term potential perhaps are the waterfront, where the current Danskammer plant is located, and the coal ash landfill located further upland. The waterfront could be developed in the future for commercial or recreational development with access to both the rail line, Danskammer Road, and the river. It could also be further enhanced and preserved as a wetland or ecological area along the Hudson River shoreline. The coal ash landfill located further up the site, when it's fully stabilized, could also be used for a solar array. It's well suited, it's flat, and has a general southern solar orientation. The site offers beautiful views of the Hudson River and could be attractive for a variety of other uses in addition to battery storage.
So now we'll hear from Nate's colleague at Penn, Nick Pevsner. And Nick focused more on how the storage facility itself would be designed, how it would comply with best practices and the code requirements of the state and municipality, And Nick teaches landscape architecture at the School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania, and he is particularly has expertise in the landscape impacts of energy projects. How did you sort of research and build up the team's knowledge in terms of best practices for the actual design and siting of battery facilities?
Our team looked at a number of other battery storage sites and studied what their constraints were. So the team looked at their footprints, at their energy storage capacity, their layout, how they were organized, what constraints the developers faced. And we also studied the NYSERDA's Battery Energy Storage System Guidebook. So NYSERDA is the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. And we looked at the Uniform Fire Code of New York, what the proper setbacks and access requirements were. And the team talked to battery storage developers to understand their rules of thumb and their requirements from the point of view of installation. Since the students first started developing the idea in their design studio, there's actually been a project that's received approval in New York City for transforming an old natural gas-fired power plant, peaker plant in Queens, into a battery storage plant. And that one is permitted for 316 megawatts, I believe. So our team's proposed battery storage project, it's not that large, but it's roughly in line with other typical New York State battery storage projects. Ours is about 60% the size of the big peaker battery storage project in Queens. So it's important to say that battery storage is safe, but it's a new technology. So fire code for batteries inside of buildings is one of those questions that's still being worked out in New York State fire code. So the design that our team developed steers clear of this uncertainty and uses the more tried and true outdoor siting for batteries. And it also takes account of all of the required setbacks and access questions. And it follows the NYSERDA Battery Energy Storage System Guidebook.
Can battery storage facilities like the one that the team has designed here, can they be built sort of in phases over time?
Absolutely. Battery storage facilities like the one that our team designed can be built in phases over time. In fact, this is pretty typical for other examples of large battery storage projects. Energy storage is already modular. The kinds of batteries that come in pre-assembled shipping container size modules can be scaled up as needed, unlike a large power plant that has a lot of centralized infrastructure and needs to do many things at once. It's pretty easy to break a battery storage project up into phases.
What are some of the other ways that battery storage can be a really kind of flexible and attractive use for a site like this?
Battery storage is a flexible and attractive use for the Danskammer site, first and foremost because it helps with moving New York's grid towards a clean energy future. New York State has aggressive decarbonization timelines in order to meet climate commitments, and New York has a goal of 3,000 megawatts of energy storage by 2030. So this project would help move the state towards that energy storage goal. NYSERDA says that energy storage is critical to New York's clean energy future. And we know that we need to decarbonize as quickly as possible, and we'll need as much battery storage as we can on the grid to unlock the full value of renewable energy. The batteries themselves are clean. They don't release air pollution as they work, and they don't cause long-term pollution problems for the site. And they help support a clean energy grid. So all of these things are positives from my point of view.
So you've heard from our experts, and Nick mentioned it, but I do just want to highlight that we also consulted with an actual battery storage developer who is working on projects in the Hudson Valley, just to sort of make sure that this design, the type of batteries used, the size, the layout was something that comported with industry best practices and was, generally technically and economically a feasible kind of project in the Hudson Valley. And she did confirm that was the case. And a clean energy transition facility at this site at up to 190 megawatts is very consistent with the state's vision for transitioning these old fossil fuel plant sites to cleaner energy infrastructure, since you've already got so much of the necessary infrastructure like transmission lines and switching stations on the site. And that's happening at a couple of different sites in Queens. There was just another announcement yesterday by the New York Power Authority about a battery storage project being developed on an old fossil fuel site. So this is just the type of opportunity that the state and developers and investors are looking for. A project like this would be eligible for financial incentives. Again, it would be able to be built in easy to finance phases. Each of those phases of about 20 megawatts could support up to about 25 construction jobs. So you could be looking at a couple of hundred jobs for construction overall during the process. Batteries are very light on the land. They are shipping container size, as you heard, so about 10 feet tall. They're very easily screened with shrubby type of vegetation. And you see here on this slide that they're very visible in bright white. That, of course, was done so that it was sort of easy to see on the slide, but you could paint these containers any color at all to blend in with the landscape, green or brown or whatever you choose. And the total capital investment for a project would be like this, would be up to approximately $115 million. Now, our more astute observers in the audience might note that that is less than the estimated capital investment in the Danskammer proposed project of $500 to $600 million. And that's true. But you also heard that the prospects of Danskammer even getting the financing to actually build its project are extremely slim right now and into the future. And even if it did somehow get the money to construct its project, it would not be able to keep this plant operating for very long due to both market and regulatory forces. So the Danskammer project is a very risky proposition from the perspective of looking at this as a major part of the local tax base. This is a project that, even if it gets its permits, is very unlikely to ever be built and operate. And if it does operate, it will do so for a few years and then it will go away. It is a much surer bet to invest in a long-term facility like a battery storage project, especially one that could be co-located with other economically beneficial uses. Next slide, please. So we've obviously focused our presentation here today on the gas plant proposal's economic feasibility and impacts, and why battery storage is a better fit from both an economic and environmental perspective. But while it's not our focus today, I would be remiss if I didn't touch briefly on some of the other reasons why Danskammer's proposal is a bad idea for the community, for the region, and New York State. We hosted Dr. David Carpenter on a webinar that focused on the public health impacts of Danskammer's proposal back in May. Dr. Carpenter is the director of the Institute for Health and the Environment at SUNY Albany, and also is a professor of environmental health sciences at the University of Albany, and he has his medical degree from Harvard Medical School. Dr. Carpenter provided us with analysis on the proposed plant's impacts to public health. Next slide, please. While the new proposed Danskammer plant, if it's built, would be more modern and efficient than the existing 65-year-old plant on the site, it is also expected that it would run much, much more often as what's called a baseload facility that operates nearly all the time. And if you recall, I mentioned earlier that the current plant very rarely operates. And for that reason, the Danskammer company itself has estimated that air emissions from the new plant could be significantly more than what is emitted on an annual basis from the current plant. You see the bar chart on the left that depicts several pollutants that are proven to adversely impact human health, and the data that is illustrated in that chart comes directly from Danskammer's December 2019 application to the New York State Siting Board on Electric Generation and the Environment. Dr. Carpenter's analysis found that air pollution from the existing Danskammer plant is already increasing the risk of respiratory, cardiovascular, and neurologic disease in residents who live nearby the plant. There are a number of peer-reviewed studies that have been done showing that people who live nearby fossil fuel power plants have a much higher incidence of those type of diseases than people who do not. And it's a bit of a silent risk that people don't think about because it's chronic exposure. It happens over time. It's not as if you drive by the power plant one day and suddenly you're stricken ill. It happens over time, and it often happens in our most vulnerable environmental justice communities. Dr. Carpenter also found that due to the expected increase in pollution from the new plant, if it's built, that if that plant is built, it will significantly increase those type of diseases in nearby residents. And if you're more interested in looking at Dr. Carpenter's full analysis, we will include in a follow-up email to everyone who's attending today a link to his presentation from our May webinar that goes into far more depth on these impacts. Next slide, please. Danskammer's application to the siting board also found that greenhouse gas emissions are expected to increase if the new plant is built by up to 4,000% from the emissions that the current plant actually emits on an annual basis. If these greenhouse gas emissions increase, this will accelerate climate change, which will directly threaten the health and well-being of people in the Hudson Valley. It will do that through more extreme weather events, warmer temperatures overall, degrading our air and water quality that we so prize here in the Hudson Valley. It will accelerate sea level rise and increase flooding in our communities, and it will adversely impact industries including tourism, forestry, and farming. Next slide, please. And before we go today, we're going to leave on this slide that shows you the potential for this site without the fossil fuel infrastructure that's been there for so long. Now, it's important to note that the battery storage project that our team designed could easily coexist with the decommissioned building structures that are currently on the site still being in place. Those buildings do not need to be taken down for this battery storage design to be viable. But of course, that's not what we would like to see. And it would certainly limit the potential for other beneficial uses on the valuable waterfront portion of the site. It's our hope that once the existing plant is decommissioned, which it certainly will be in the not distant future due to the market and regulatory forces we discussed earlier, that Danskammer will do right by the community and will dismantle these structures. But if not, it's possible that a combination of public and private funding could be brought to bear to transition that area to a much more sustainable use. And I also don't want to be misleading here. Scenic Hudson is not a battery storage developer, and we don't own the site, and nor do our experts. Right now, the ball is in Danskammer's court to determine whether it has the courage to change its plan for the site or sell it to somebody who has a better plan. With a fossil fuel plant being sited on this location for more than 65 years, it's really all people know of the site is where the power plant is. And we just hope that today's presentation has opened some minds to the other possibilities for this site that can still bring those very important economic benefits to the community long into the future, and can do so without harming people's health and without harming the environment. And I want to thank everyone for attending tonight. I hope that some folks got their questions answered, and those that we weren't able to answer in real time, we will try to get back to you. We will also be following up with an email in the next day or two, which will have a link to the recording of this event. So you will have it if you'd like to refer back to it. And we'll also include, as I mentioned, a link to Dr. Carpenter's presentation from back in May if you'd like to hear more about his public health analysis. And, as final words, we urge you to spread the word about this alternative and the possibilities for the site to your friends, to your neighbors, and to your local and state leaders. Let them know that there are other things that can be cited here that can bring a lot of the same benefits without any of the harmful impacts. Thank you all very much for coming tonight, and everyone enjoy the impending snowstorm, stay safe, and enjoy the snow day tomorrow.